I was living in the desert, dehydrated. My face was pale from fasting. And the only thing that I could think about was the women who I'd seen dancing in Rome. It's a quote from Jerome, Saint Jerome. And it describes how lust, no matter how much you try to run away from it, it follows you. And let me tell you how lust tried to steal my soul, almost stole my soul. This isn't an exaggeration. There was a day that I was laying on the floor of my house, the living room floor, lights off, blinds drawn. It was cold inside of the house. It was colder inside of me. And there was a deafening pressure, a deafening silence against my ears. And I remember making this groaning sound, this low, breathless moan. And it felt like my soul was withering away, like a flower that had been cut from the root, drying up under the sun. But I wasn't grieving one thing. I wasn't angry at one moment. I was hollow. I'd become hollow because of my own lust. And now when I look back at it in retrospect, I can clearly see that I was a different person from before and after the time that I first had sex. First engaged in an act, a sacred act that should be waited until marriage. But if I could speak to my younger self, now I know it's a mistake, but there's no way that I could convince my younger self to not take that path. Because even at the time, I knew that it was wrong. I knew it was something that I shouldn't do. But the way that I saw it is some aspects of culture, some aspects of society, God tells you it's wrong, but we treat it like bumping elbows and wink wink. It's wrong, but it's not really wrong. And so before I had gone down that path, there was a whisper in my mind. I'd had opportunities to go down that path prior, and there was always a whisper in my mind telling me not to do it. But truly, I wanted to silence that whisper. And eventually, I did. Eventually, I overrode that whisper. And I saw it initially as you get older in life, things start to change. Things get added as you mature. One day you're in high school and all of a sudden maybe you've started drinking. You live in a bedroom at your parents' house. And a few years later, you're in college living in a dorm with a friend. And so things changed. And I thought that adding this sacred act, this act that should be waited until marriage, that should be held off until marriage, I didn't really believe that it should be held off. I thought it was just another thing that got added. And the reason I know that I couldn't convince myself, my younger self, is because prior to making that decision and going down that path of lust, it seemed like there was a joke that everybody else was in on except me. It seemed like there was a club that other people were a part of, and I didn't get the joke. I wasn't a part of the club because I'd never done the thing. Until finally I was 18 and in college. And it was with a girl who I was dating at the time. And the tricky thing about lust is that it truly is intertwined with love. I loved the girl that I was dating, and it wasn't a pure love, but it was mostly innocent, except for the denigration of this sacred act. Most of it was innocent until it wasn't. way that it changed me over time, when it went from something fairly innocuous to completely changing who I am, is that I can see now. I was playing football in college, and the way that I eventually began to perceive football, prior to making this decision, I perceived football in a goal-oriented way. I loved the game of football, but slowly, after making this new decision, it became something that could win me the affection and the attraction of women. And the same thing with weightlifting. I was working out in a way that was goal-oriented, trying to get stronger, trying to accomplish certain goals. But over time, weightlifting became about vanity. And partying was never good. I was drinking alcohol in high school, but even partying was a somewhat innocent thing. I was hanging out with my friends. It was about having a good time. But partying became about who is the most attractive woman that I could end up with tonight. And so about probably a year and a half after going down that path, the girl that I was dating at the time, her and I broke up. And I'm not saying that I was meant to end up with that woman, but it is clear at this point that it's such a heavy burden. The cultural pressure that gets put on young people to make that decision, to join the club, to join in on the joke. When you invite that into your life, that sacred act that should be held off for until marriage, it muddies the waters. And it's something that I think many people don't admit, but especially over time, it convolutes things and makes it hard for two people to trust each other. So after my initial girlfriend and I broke up, I found myself pursuing my lustful desires diligently. There was an emptiness inside of me, a void inside of me, a bottomless void that I kept trying to fill. And it dictated my life. It was a false god that I was serving. Whereas before, life is always hard, but I was observing life and I was living fully. I was immersed in the things that I wanted to do and the things that I enjoyed. But in a way, everything became about serving my own lust, coming off as more attractive to women, vanity. And so initially, it did give me more life. It made me feel more alive. It made me feel like I was a part of a club that prior to this I'd been naive to. But over time it stole my soul or it drained my soul at least. Because about 2.5 years later, I found myself in a state of despair and nihilism. I was looking at life as though it were meaningless. And in my heart, I didn't think that it was meaningless. I didn't truly believe that it was meaningless. But in retrospect, I can see the reason why this nihilism was weighing on me. This sense that everything is meaningless, everything is the same, nothing is sacred, nothing is more important than anything else, is because, one, that's how I was acting. I denigrated the most sacred act. I was treating life as though there was nothing truly sacred. But even more acute, I had to intellectually, logically believe that life was meaningless, because that's what served my lust. If I would have turned my attention to God, if I would have turned my attention to celibacy and chastity, if I would have seen that what I was doing was the denigration of a sacred act, I would have had to give up my lustful desires. And it's lust. It's like an invisible boa constrictor that you don't even realize you're being wrapped up, and by the time that you realize you are being wrapped up, it's already suffocating the life out of you. And on that day when I found myself moaning on my living room floor, a miracle happened. And that same whisper that had initially told me, don't make the decision, don't go down that path, it spoke to me, and it said something that I was too far gone to even understand the words that it said, but I recognized the truth of the voice. It was a small whisper. And I made the decision to follow that voice. I realized that I'd been being deceived. I realized that the way that I was living, I didn't even know that it was lust. I didn't know how the way that I was living was wrong. But I knew I had to follow that voice again. And I didn't fall away from my lustful ways. I was still lustful for probably 6 years. And in the same way that Jerome went into the desert, and even still out there, he heard, all he could think about was the women, the dancing women of Rome. If you get 2 years of pleasure out of lustful ways, it takes 6 years to even begin to cleanse your mind. But the miraculous thing is that voice did speak to me again. That whisper did come back. And it convinced me to live honestly. It convinced me that my life was a deception, and I had begun deceiving myself. And although it was going to take work, and it was going to be harder than if I would have never made that decision to begin with, there was a way forward. There was a way forward.